Joyce, let me begin with you and what we're waiting for in Georgia, the judge to rule on Trump's First Amendment claim. Anything stick out to you in today's hearing, especially about how the judge might handle things going forward?
Well, look, the law is pretty clear in this regard. The law says that the First Amendment doesn't protect the guy who walks into the bank and says, "Stick 'em up." People use words to commit crimes. And so Donald Trump is charged not with the speech itself, but rather with the conduct that involves committing the crimes. And sometimes he spoke in furtherance of those crimes. I think Judge McAfee will dispense of this very quickly. Judge Chutkan dismissed a similar motion in Washington, D.C. It just doesn't have any merit.
Molly, one of our two leading presidential candidates now has so many ongoing court cases that they are delaying each other, and he's actually using that as an argument to delay, each case. We've still got 7 months until Election Day. How confident, if at all, are you that our institutions, like the courts and the election systems, can actually handle the weeks and months ahead with the amount of stress testing Donald Trump is putting them under?
Right. I mean, this is this big question. Have our institutions held, right? Have the guardrails held? And look, I mean, the truth is he's got all these criminal counts, and yet maybe only one trial is going to happen before the election. So that is, in my mind, not a great sign. I mean, Trump has managed to really punt a lot of stuff by spending a lot of money on legal fees, right? About $100 million, maybe a little less. And so I do think that that has worked for him, this delay. That said, I really believe truly that this whole candidate Trump, while it might work in a midterm, I just have trouble imagining that swing voters are going to love the candidate who's on trial for paying an adult film star. Even if the case is a little bit unproven, I still think the optics of that are so questionable. And I just think it's going to hurt him.
Hugo, Jeffrey Clark is going through a disbarment hearing. John Eastman, another key January 6 figure, has also been recommended for disbarment. But it's not like they're banned from having a big role in Trump world. And it seems that these guys are not going away so long as Donald Trump stays in the picture. I mean, to some extent, these were architects of the political side of what he was trying to do on January the 6th.
Yeah, I think that's right. Someone like John Eastman can be disbarred, and if Trump were to win the election, he's the kind of candidate that I think Trump, if president, would install in the White House as a senior advisor to give him the sort of advice that he wants to hear, right? Because that has always been the mainstay of Trump world, is the people who survive are the people who tell Trump what he wants to hear. Someone like Jeff Clark, I think is more interesting. Jeff Clark has long been someone that Trump has identified as a person he would want to install in a very high position in the Justice Department if he were reelected. And if he were disbarred, then that would obviously preclude that route. If he escapes disbarment, though, someone like Jeff Clark is a good candidate to be the head of one of DOJ's main components, maybe like the criminal division. Jeff Clark has previously told me that that is not what he's aiming for, but who knows? He might end up as the deputy attorney general. It's just, these are the kind of people that Trump wants to surround himself with. And I don't think disbarment necessarily is going to be an obstacle for Trump world to put them in kind of high places in government.
And Molly, as Trump possibly and his acolytes think about who they will put in a second Trump term, the Republicans continue to push out the likes of Liz Cheney. They have basically, turned against Republicans like her and others. She's out here trying to sound the alarm. Is she doing enough to prevent the outcome that she's warning about, other than simply talking about it at events and conferences?
Well, I mean, she has a limited number of options, right? Because she lost her congressional seat. I have to say, I'm listening to that and I'm thinking, oh, my God, I agree with Liz Cheney. Right. That's probably the first and last time I've ever said that. But she's being think about all the Republicans who were afraid to go against Trump. I mean, think about Mitch McConnell, right? Powerful, wealthy, has security, refused to go against Trump. All of these people who were just like, it's not worth it, right? I'll just take, what I'll just endorse. Who cares? It's not worth the threats. And here's Liz Cheney, and she's really doing a brave thing. And there are not very many Republicans doing it. So good for her. I mean, I hope there'll be more. And my fantasy is that Nikki Haley will come out. I don't think that's likely. But, you know, you're going to need a critical mass. And then there are the generals who served in this admin who have a lot of criticisms. And I hope they'll come out publicly and speak out.
It seems the only problem with the more Republicans come out publicly, whether it's a Mike Pence, Liz Cheney, maybe potentially a Nikki Haley, the more the Republican version of Trump world pushes them further out and then suddenly says they are traitors, they've betrayed us. So it's not like they can get a footing within the Republican Party and expand that footing. It's they shrink within the Republican Party and they become less, as we've seen with others leaving the Republican Party in Congress.
Yeah, you're never going to get that MAGA base. I mean, they're just too baked in. The question is, can you pick off enough people on the side so you win the Electoral College? I mean, that's all that matters. And then I don't know, we do, you know, some kind of, you know, the question is we have to get those people back to democracy as we know it.
And we'll see what happens with the Republican Party after 2024. An interesting thing, Joyce, that Liz Cheney talked about was the Supreme Court and the justices. Watch this.
I think it's very important that the Supreme Court recognize that what he's doing is a delaying tactic and that the American people, it cannot be the case that a president of the United States can attempt to overturn an election and seize power, and that our justice system is incapable of holding a trial, of holding him to account before the next election. That cannot be the case.
It seems like that is exactly what is going to happen, Joyce, just purely from a calendar perspective, regardless of how the decisions are made about any of his legal challenges that are working their way up right now. We're seeing Trump working the justice system in real time. And is this giving Americans a good look at how some people with resources or infinite resources can take advantage of the courts with all of these various tactics of delaying and appealing and interjecting new ideas and philosophies that don't seem applicable?
Trump seems to me to be in a category of one when it comes to his ability to manipulate the court system. I mean, I think there are fair criticisms to be launched about how the citizen treats wealthier people as opposed to folks who have appointed counsel. But that's not what this is about. This is about someone who manipulates the system and takes advantage of the baked-in deference for the former leader of the country when he has proven over and over again he's no longer entitled to that deference. So here's where we are. The Supreme Court will hear Trump's case on April 25th. They will have two paths at that point in time. They can either continue to indulge him in delay and prove what Liz Cheney is saying. Like Molly, I find myself in the very unusual position of agreeing with her here. But the reality is that the court can either indulge Trump or they can be prepared to rule very quickly after they hear argument in this case. It's not a tough case at this point in time. It's very clear that a former president can't have absolute immunity to engage in any sort of criminal act, including trying to interfere with an election, for the very simple reason that if that's the law, there's nothing that prevents Joe Biden from doing it following this election. So we know what the result of this court case has to be. The only question is whether the Supreme Court will understand the urgency and issue a ruling in a timely way that permits this case to get back on track ahead of the election. And of course, that window is closing.
Joyce, do you think it is safe to say, just from an outsider's observation here, that the courts and the Supreme Court revere the fact that Donald Trump was the former president more so than he reveres the court systems? They, as you said, to some extent, they are giving him so much deference just because he occupied this former position, and they're giving him the benefit of the doubt in so many layers of these processes that normally would not be afforded to an ordinary citizen.
You know, I think the courts are thinking about how will a future president be treated. It's much like what we saw during the Mueller investigation. Bob Mueller was steeped in institutional norms. He thought, what does this look like when the next president is investigated? And very much an effort to preserve our democratic institutions and our rule of law system. And of course, as you point out, Donald Trump has respect for none of that. Donald Trump is purely transactional. He's thinking at this point only about how he can save his own skin. How can he stay out of jail? So he's willing to manipulate a system that's trying to preserve itself. And that, I think, is why we see all of the tension and why there's so much frustration with the courts. But what we can't do is let Trump completely destroy the system. And that means that the courts have to walk a knife's edge here.
Hugo, this week we saw a small victory for someone who suffered because of election lies. The Maricopa County recorder filed a defamation suit against Kari Lake, and her lawyers say they will not dispute the charges. But in the long run, isn't the damage here already done?
Yeah, look, people like Kari Lake, when they run for office, and, when she ran for office, she ran on a platform that the 2020 election was stolen, that her own election in the midterms was stolen. And that is a message that is so deeply baked into the MAGA base now that I don't know if there's any way for real Trump fans to come back from that. I think the real consequence of all of the election denialism that is kind of manifested is that a lot of the country simply just doesn't believe that elections can be free and fair and that they can be free of fraud. I mean, Trump, every time he goes on the stump, every time he speaks at a rally, has been to drill that message home for his supporters. And Kari Lake has been no different. And even if the defamation suit against her succeeds, that is going to be a long time down the road. And the damage, I think, has already been done.
Hey everyone, MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.